The mansion had always been silent. For 38 years, Elliot Graves lived in this carefully constructed vacuum, building an empire worth billions while the world called him the Silent Billionaire. But when a new maid arrived, she began noticing things that didn't add up. Locked rooms, missing medical records, fear in people's eyes. Then one night, she left him a note with 8 words that shattered everything he believed about himself. Because Naomi Carter hadn't come by accident, and the object she carried wasn't just a family heirloom. It was the key to a truth so devastating that powerful people had spent decades burying it. And today they were both about to discover that some silences aren't protection at all, but prisons built by those terrified of what the truth might reveal. Before we move forward, please like and subscribe for more stories. The mansion existed in a vacuum of sound. 38,000 square feet of marble, glass, and silence stretched across the hillside like a monument to control. Inside, the staff moved like ghosts, their footsteps swallowed by thick carpeting that cost more per yard than most people earned in a month. Doors closed on hydraulic hinges, whispering shut with barely a breath. Even the kitchen operated under strict protocols. No clanging pots, no running water at full pressure, no voices above a murmur. This was the world of Elliot Graves, and silence was its only law. At 38 years old, Elliot commanded a fortune that stretched into 11 figures. His empire spanned technology, medical devices, and investment portfolios that moved markets with a single transaction. The media called him the Silent Billionaire, crafting narratives of genius born from limitation, of a man who turned deafness into his greatest advantage. They wrote features about his ability to read lips in 6 languages, his mastery of sign language, his legendary focus in boardrooms where others drowned in noise. But inside the mansion, away from cameras and carefully staged interviews, Elliot Graves was something else entirely. He was a man trapped in glass, watching life happen on the other side. The morning light cut through his office windows at precisely 7 a.m., just as it did every day. Elliot sat at his desk, reviewing acquisition reports for the merger that would define his legacy. NeuroBridge Technologies, a medical empire specializing in neurological implants and cognitive enhancement systems. The irony wasn't lost on him. His company would soon profit from devices that promised to fix human limitations, to bridge gaps between damaged neural pathways and functional lives. Yet Elliot had never tried to fix his own. He pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling the familiar pressure that lived behind his eyes. The contradiction had been eating at him for months, growing sharper as the merger approached. Every patent he reviewed, every clinical trial result, every glowing testimonial from patients who regained lost function, it all pointed back to the same question. Why had he built his entire identity around being unfixable? A knock vibrated through the door. Elliot looked up to see his aunt entering without waiting for permission. Margaret Graves moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. At 63, she maintained the sharp elegance of old money, her silver hair pulled back in a style that hadn't changed in 20 years. She had been his legal guardian after his parents died when he was 8, and she still managed parts of his life with the same iron efficiency. She signed as she spoke, her hands moving with practiced precision. The board meeting is in 2 hours. Victor needs your final numbers on the NeuroBridge integration. Elliot nodded, his own signs economical. I'll have them ready. Margaret's eyes lingered on him, reading something in his expression that made her frown. You look tired. Did Dr. Crane adjust your medication? I'm Phoenix. You don't look fine. You look distracted. She moved closer, her perfume reaching him before she did, something floral and expensive that he recognized by scent alone. This merger is too important for you to be unfocused. Everything we built depends on this going smoothly. Elliot turned back to his screens, a clear dismissal. Margaret hesitated, then left with the controlled grace she'd perfected over decades of managing his life. The household hierarchy had been established long before Elliot took control of his fortune. Margaret handled family matters and public relations. Dr. Lowell Crane, his private physician since childhood, managed his health with obsessive precision. Victor Hale, his chief operating officer, treated Elliot less like a person and more like a valuable asset that needed protection and optimization. They all orbited him, dependent on his success, invested in keeping him exactly as he was. Later that morning, Elliot encountered Dr. Crane in the medical wing of the mansion, a fully equipped suite that rivaled most private clinics. Crane was reviewing charts, his reading glasses perched on his thin nose, his expression perpetually concerned. "Your cortisol levels are elevated," Crane said, signing automatically as he spoke. "I'm increasing your evening supplement." Elliot watched the doctor's lips form words, reading the concern that lived permanently in the man's face. Crane had been there for every medical decision, every evaluation, every adjustment to the carefully calibrated life Elliot led. Sometimes Elliot wondered if the doctor saw him as a patient or a lifelong project. "I don't need more supplements," Elliot signed. "I need less interference." Crane's face tightened. "Your neurology is delicate, Elliot. We've always known that. Any disruption to your routine could have serious consequences." "Consequences?" Elliot signed back, his movements sharp. "You always talk about consequences. What about living?" The doctor opened his mouth to respond, but Elliot had already turned away. The news came that afternoon through Margaret, delivered with her characteristic efficiency. "Mrs. Patterson has been let go." Elliot looked up from his work. Mrs. Patterson had been his primary maid for 17 years. She knew his routines better than anyone, anticipated his needs before he signaled them, maintained his private spaces with perfect discretion. "Why?" he signed. "Health issues," Margaret replied, her hands moving smoothly. "Nothing serious. But at her age, the work here is demanding. We've already arranged for a replacement. She starts tomorrow." Something about the explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth. Elliot studied his aunt's face, but Margaret had decades of practice hiding her thoughts. "What kind of health issues? Does it matter?" "She'll receive a generous severance. The transition will be seamless." Margaret's smile was pleasant and completely opaque. "The new maid comes highly recommended. Her name is Naomi Carter." That night, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something in his carefully controlled world had shifted. He'd noticed Margaret and Dr. Crane in intense conversation earlier, their voices low, their body language tense. When they saw him, they'd smoothed their expressions and changed the subject. Mrs. Patterson had been asking questions lately. He'd seen her in his study once, looking at old photo albums from his childhood, her expression troubled. When she noticed him, she'd closed the album quickly and left without explanation. Now she was gone. Elliot stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the manicured grounds that stretched into darkness. The isolation he'd built his life around suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison. Naomi Carter arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a single small suitcase and an air of quiet observation. She was in her late 20s, with dark skin, natural hair pulled back simply, and eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to stare. The head of household staff walked her through the protocols, the silence rules, the communication preferences, the specific ways Mr. Graves liked his spaces maintained. Naomi listened, nodded, asked occasional questions. Her voice was soft, measured, never rising above what was necessary. "Mr. Graves primarily uses sign language," the house manager explained. "Do you know ASL?" "Some," Naomi replied. "I'm not fluent, but I can communicate." "He reads lips as well. Just speak clearly when facing him." Naomi was assigned to Elliot's private wing, his bedroom, sitting room, study, and personal library. It was unusual for a new employee to have such immediate access, but Margaret had insisted. Elliot would need consistency during the merger, she'd said. "No disruptions." Their first interaction happened that afternoon. Elliot was in his sitting room, reviewing contracts on his tablet, when Naomi entered to clean. She knocked first, waited for the vibration sensor to flash, then entered with her supplies. She moved efficiently, but not frantically, her presence neither intrusive nor invisible. Most staff tried to disappear around him, shrinking into the background as if their very existence might disturb him. Naomi simply did her work. When she needed to move past him, she signed, "Excuse me." The signs were clumsy, unpracticed, but genuine. Elliot watched her with more attention than he intended. Everyone else who signed to him did so with professional fluency, staff trained specifically for his household, business associates who'd learned to communicate with him. Naomi signed like someone who'd learned for one specific person, not as a professional skill. She reached for a stack of books on the upper shelf, stretching slightly. As she brought them down to dust, one slipped from her grip. The book hit the floor with what must have been a solid thump. Elliot didn't react. He never reacted sounds. But Naomi froze, her eyes snapping to him, watching with an intensity that felt wrong for someone who just dropped a book. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic. She was studying him, measuring something, as if she'd expected a different response. The moment passed. Naomi picked up the book, finished her work, and left with a polite nod. But Elliot couldn't shake the strange tension of that moment, the way she'd watched him, waiting for something that never came. Over the next few days, Naomi became part of the household rhythm. She volunteered for tasks others avoided, organizing Elliot's personal files, managing his wardrobe, preparing his private sitting room in the early mornings before he started work. She learned his routines faster than anyone before her, anticipating needs before he communicated them. Yet there was something else beneath her efficiency. She lingered sometimes, her eyes traveling to places others never looked. The medical equipment stored in the hallway closet, the photographs from his childhood, particularly the ones from when he was very young, the locked door to his old nursery, and used for 3 decades. Elliot found himself noticing her more than he should. The way she moved without startling him, how she seemed to watch his face when others spoke around him. Most people looked at him when they wanted his attention. Naomi looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. One evening, she came to bring fresh linens to his bedroom. Elliot was at his desk, working late. She signed a polite greeting, then began her work. As she smoothed the sheets, she hummed. Just a soft melody, barely audible to anyone who might hear it. Elliot didn't hear it, but he felt something, a vibration through the floor, faint and rhythmic. It traveled up through his chair, into his body, creating a sensation he couldn't name. Not sound, but something adjacent to it. A presence. He turned to look at her. Naomi was focused on her task, unaware he was watching. Or perhaps not unaware at all. That night, after Naomi had returned to her small room in the staff quarters, she opened her suitcase and removed a false bottom. Inside was a carefully wrapped bundle and several old documents. She handled them with the reverence of artifacts, spreading them across her bed. The documents were medical records, patient files, incident reports, all stamped with logos from clinics and research facilities that no longer existed. Names had been redacted, but dates remained. Treatments performed on children, neurological interventions, experimental procedures. In the center of it all was a small medical wristband, the kind given to hospital patients. It was decades old, the plastic yellowed and cracked, but the name printed on it was still legible. Elliot Graves, age 5. Naomi touched the band gently, her expression hardening with old grief and newer determination. She'd waited years for this opportunity. Months of applications, background checks, interviews. She'd made herself the perfect candidate, experienced, discreet, unremarkable. Now she was inside, and the real work could begin. The next morning, Elliot found himself in an unusual situation, an unscheduled conversation with Naomi. She'd come to ask about specific preferences for organizing his study, and he gestured for her to sit. They communicated through a combination of her clumsy signing and writing on a notepad he provided. "How long have you worked in private homes?" he wrote. 6 years, she wrote back. "Different families. I like the quiet work. Most people don't like quiet." Naomi looked at him directly, her dark eyes steady. Maybe they haven't learned to listen to it yet. The response surprised him. People usually gave him platitudes about silence being golden or made awkward jokes about the benefits of peace and quiet. Naomi's answer suggested something else, that silence was a skill, a language in itself. "What does silence feel like to you?" she wrote, then paused before adding, "If that's not too personal." No one had ever asked him that. They asked about his business, his achievements, how he managed without hearing. They asked about sign language and lip reading and assistive technology. But no one had ever asked what silence felt like. Elliot picked up the pen, considered his answer. Like living underwater, he finally wrote. Everything filtered, everything distant. Naomi read his words and nodded slowly. She didn't offer sympathy or inspiration. She just acknowledged the truth of it. Something in Elliot's chest loosened slightly. Later that day, Naomi was assigned to clean a rarely used section of the mansion, the old medical wing where Dr. Crane had examined Elliot throughout his childhood. Most of the equipment had been updated or moved, but one room remained locked, preserved like a time capsule. The head of household staff gave Naomi the key with little thought. It was just storage now, old furniture and outdated equipment waiting to be cataloged and removed. Naomi opened the door to a room frozen in time. Child-sized examination tables, cabinets filled with vintage audiology equipment, hearing test devices that looked decades old. Along one wall, storage drawers held files, patient records from when this had been an active examination room. She pulled out a drawer at random. The files inside were from when Elliot was young, ages 4, 5, 6. They documented regular neurological examinations, hearing tests, developmental assessments. But around age 6, the records simply stopped. No explanation, no transfer notice, just an abrupt end. Naomi photographed several documents with her phone, her hands steady despite her racing heart. This was it, the gap in the record, the place where something had changed. She was so focused that she didn't notice the door opening until Margaret's voice cut through the room. "What are you doing in here?" Naomi turned, keeping her expression neutral. "Cleaning. I was given the key." Margaret's eyes swept the open drawer, the files visible inside. "This room is private. Off limits. Who gave you access?" "Mrs. Henderson. She said everything in this wing needed organizing." She was mistaken. Margaret's voice was ice. "This room stays locked. You will not enter again." Naomi nodded, closing the drawer carefully. "Understand. I'm sorry for the confusion." As she left, she felt Margaret's eyes burning into her back. That night, she knew there would be conversations about her, questions about her background, her intentions, her security clearance. But she got what she came for. The photographs were encrypted and uploaded before she even returned to her room. The tension in the household became palpable over the next few days. Margaret watched Naomi with barely concealed suspicion. Dr. Crane found excuses to appear wherever she was working, asking pointed questions about her previous employment. Even Victor, who rarely acknowledged staff, seemed to take notice of her presence. But Elliot intervened in a way no one expected. When Victor suggested reassigning Naomi to general household duties away from Elliot's private wing, Elliot signed a clear refusal. "She stays," he signed to Victor during a tense meeting in his office. "She understands the routines." "She's been here less than 2 weeks, Victor argued. "We know nothing about her." "You know exactly as much as you need to know." Elliot signed back, his hands sharp with irritation. "I don't want another adjustment. I want consistency." Victor looked to Margaret for support, but Elliot's aunt simply nodded. If Elliot is comfortable with her, then she stays. But Margaret's eyes held a warning. This wasn't over. Naomi understood the scrutiny she was under. She became even more careful, more invisible, more perfect in her duties. But she also continued her subtle observations, her quiet tests. One afternoon, while Elliot sat in his study with his eyes closed, reviewing something in his mind, Naomi moved deliberately across the room. She placed books on shelves with varying levels of pressure. She opened and closed drawers. She created patterns of vibration through the floor. Elliot's face remained still, but his breathing changed slightly. His fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. Something in him was responding, reacting to stimuli that shouldn't register. Naomi's heart raced as she realized what she was seeing. The suppression wasn't complete. There were pathways still active, connections still firing beneath the surface. Her mother had been right. That evening, Naomi requested a brief meeting with Elliot to return a personal item she'd found while organizing his study, a watch that had slipped behind a bookshelf. It was a flimsy excuse, but Elliot agreed. When she entered his sitting room, she brought something with her. A small wooden box, antique and carefully preserved. She set it on the table between them and signed, "This belonged to my mother. She wanted me to have it, but I think you should see it first." Elliot looked at the box, then at her. His expression was questioning but patient. Naomi opened the box carefully. Inside was a music box, the kind with a small mechanical movement that played a simple tune. But she didn't wind it. Instead, she placed it in front of him and wrote on the notepad, "My mother worked in neurological research 25 years ago. She left me this. Touch it." Elliot hesitated, then reached out and placed his palm flat against the box's surface. Naomi wound the key slowly. The music box began to play, its mechanism creating vibrations that traveled through the wood into Elliot's hand, up his arm. His eyes widened. His breath caught. It wasn't sound. He couldn't hear the melody. But something inside him responded. A faint internal pressure, a sensation like memory trying to surface through fog. "What is this?" he signed, his hands trembling slightly. Naomi wrote carefully, "Proof that you're more than they told you." Before Elliot could respond, the door opened. Dr. Crane stood there, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as he saw the music box, saw Elliot's face, read the tension in the room. "What's going on here?" Crane demanded, signing as he spoke. "Elliot, are you all right?" Naomi closed the music box smoothly and stood. "Mr. Graves asked about my mother's antiques. I was showing him a family piece." Crane's eyes narrowed. "Elliot doesn't need to be disturbed with staff personal items. Please leave." Naomi nodded and left, taking the music box with her. But as she passed Dr. Crane, she saw something in his face that confirmed everything. Fear. That night, Margaret came to Naomi's quarters. There was no pretense of politeness now. "I know you're not here by accident," Margaret said, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what you think you'll accomplish, but let me be clear. Elliot's condition is delicate. His neurology is complex. People who have interfered with his treatment have lost their careers. Some have lost much more." Naomi met her gaze steadily. "I'm just doing my job, Ms. Graves. See that you do. Only that. Nothing more." Margaret's smile was cold. "There are many maids. You are easily replaced." After Margaret left, Naomi sat on her bed, her heart pounding. The threat was clear, but so was the fear behind it. They were terrified of something. Not of Naomi herself. She was nobody, powerless. They were terrified of what Elliot might discover, which meant there was something to discover. 2 nights later, Naomi left a note in Elliot's study. Just one sentence, written in neat handwriting on a piece of paper folded and tucked inside a book she knew he'd open the next morning. When Elliot found it, alone in his study before dawn, he read the words 3 times, his hands shaking. "What if I told you? You were never deaf." The world tilted. The walls pressed in. Everything he'd built his identity on, the silence, the isolation, the idea that he was fundamentally different from everyone else, suddenly felt like sand beneath his feet. Elliot stared at the words until they blurred. Then he stood, crossed to his desk, and began searching through files he'd never questioned before. Medical records, birth certificates, childhood reports. Somewhere in the perfect silence of his mansion, a crack had formed, and through it, the truth was beginning to seep in. The note had destroyed something fundamental in Elliot Graves. For 2 days, he carried those words with him like a weight pressing against his chest. What if I told you? You were never deaf. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on the Neurobridge merger that had consumed months of his life. Every time he closed his eyes, the question burned behind his eyelids, demanding answers he didn't have. He'd spent 38 years building an identity around his deafness. It was the cornerstone of everything. His isolation, his business empire, his carefully controlled existence. The media's fascination with him, the board's willingness to follow his vision, even his own sense of self. All of it rested on the foundation of being the silent billionaire. If that foundation was a lie, then what was he? On the 3rd morning after finding Naomi's note, Elliot made a decision. He found her in the library, dusting shelves with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. He touched her shoulder to get her attention. When she turned, he signed simply, "We need to talk." Privately, Naomi glanced toward the doorway, checking for observers, then nodded. They met that evening in Elliot's private sitting room. He'd disabled the security cameras, something he'd never done before, and made sure the door was locked. When Naomi entered, she carried a tension that matched his own. Elliot wasted no time. He pulled out the note and placed it on the table between them. "Explain," he signed. Naomi sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if measuring how much truth he could handle. Then she picked up the notepad and began to write. "My mother was Dr. Sarah Carter. She worked as an audio-neurological engineer for a private research clinic 27 years ago. The clinic was funded by the Graves family." Elliot's hands moved sharply. "What clinic? What research?" Naomi wrote quickly, her handwriting getting messy as emotion bled into the words. "A pediatric neurological research facility. It specialized in sensory processing disorders in gifted children. My mother helped design neural suppression systems, devices meant to manage children who experienced extreme sensory overload." She paused, looking up at him. "You were one of those children?" The room seemed to tilt. Elliot gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. "No," he signed. "I was born deaf. My medical records were altered," Naomi wrote. "My mother tried to expose what happened. She died in a car accident 6 months later. But before she died, she left me files, evidence, and instructions to find you if I could." Elliot stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His breath came too fast, his heart hammering against his ribs. This couldn't be real. It was conspiracy theory nonsense, the delusions of a grief-stricken daughter trying to make sense of her mother's death. But then why did it feel true? "Prove it," he signed, turning back to her. "Show me evidence." Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "I need your help. There are sealed archives in this house, records that Dr. Crane and your aunt have kept locked. If we can access them, we'll find the truth." "Where?" "The medical wing, the room I was caught in. There's more there than just old files. There's equipment, documentation, everything from the original project." Elliot's mind raced. The locked room, Margaret's fury when Naomi had been found there, Dr. Crane's constant warnings about his delicate neurology, the gaps in his childhood medical records. "We'll need to be careful," he signed. "If you're right, they'll do anything to keep this buried." Naomi wrote one more sentence. "They already have." That night, Elliot couldn't stop thinking about Naomi's claims. He sat in his study, pulling up every digital file he had access to, medical records, family documents, financial reports from his childhood. He was looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that didn't fit the narrative he'd been told his entire life. Around midnight, he found something. A series of payments made by the Graves Family Trust when he was 5 years old. Massive payments, millions of dollars, to something called the Hush Foundation. The payments continued monthly for 2 years, then stopped abruptly. Elliot searched for any information about the Hush Foundation. Nothing came up. No website, no registration records, no public documentation. It was as if the organization had been erased from existence. But the payments were real. The money had gone somewhere. He pulled up older files, digging deeper into his family's financial history. More payments appeared, this time to individual doctors, specialists, facilities that no longer existed. All of it concentrated around the years he was 4, 5, and 6 years old. The years just before his medical records claimed he'd been officially diagnosed as profoundly deaf. Elliot's hands shook as he closed the files. Naomi wasn't lying. Something had happened to him. Something his family had paid enormous amounts of money to facilitate and then to hide. The next morning, Elliot confronted Dr. Crane in the medical wing. He found the doctor reviewing blood work, his reading glasses perched on his nose as always. "I want to try something," Elliot signed without preamble. "Sensory response testing. Neural pathway evaluation. Everything." Dr. Crane looked up, his expression immediately wary. "What brought this on?" "The NeuroBridge merger. I've been reviewing their technology. I want to understand my own neurology better." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Crane studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Elliot, we discussed this. Your neural pathways are extremely sensitive. Any kind of stimulation beyond what you're accustomed to could trigger. Could trigger what? Elliot's signs were sharp, demanding. You always talk about consequences, but you never explain what they are. Seizures. Psychological breaks. Your brain developed without auditory input. Introducing stimuli now could be catastrophic. Or it could reveal something you don't want me to know. The words hung between them. Dr. Crane's face went very still, his expression carefully neutral. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Elliot stepped closer. I found payment records. The Hush Foundation. Millions of dollars when I was 5 years old. What was that for? The blood drained from Crane's face. He set down his clipboard with trembling hands. Where did you find that information? Answer the question. Elliot, you need to stop this. Right now. You're digging into things you don't understand. Then help me understand. Elliot's signs were violent now, his control breaking. What did you do to me? Dr. Crane backed up, shaking his head. I saved your life. We all did. You were suffering, Elliot. Your mind was processing sensory information at levels that would have destroyed you. The intervention was necessary. What intervention? But Crane was already moving toward the door, his hand reaching for his phone. I need to call Margaret. You're not stable right now. This conversation is over. Elliot blocked his path. I want the truth. All of it. Or I start making phone calls of my own. To journalists. To medical boards. To everyone. Crane froze. For the first time in Elliot's memory, the doctor looked genuinely afraid. You don't know what you're threatening. The people involved in your treatment, they're powerful. They have resources. If you start exposing this, you won't just be destroying your own life. You'll be putting everyone at risk. Everyone? Or just the people who experimented on a child? Crane's mouth opened and closed. Then he pushed past Elliot and left the room without another word. Elliot stood alone in the medical wing, his entire body shaking with rage and terror and something that felt like grief. He'd been right. Naomi had been right. They'd done something to him. Something they'd hidden for 33 years. That afternoon, Elliot found Naomi in his study. He locked the door and signed urgently. You were right. Crane as much as admitted it. We need to access those sealed records tonight. Naomi nodded, but her expression was troubled. She wrote quickly. They know something's wrong. They'll be watching. Let them watch. I own this house. These are my records. I have a right to see them. Rights don't matter if they destroy the evidence first. Elliot paused, then made a decision. Then we move now. This afternoon, while they're still scrambling. They move quickly and quietly. Elliot used his authority to dismiss most of the household staff for the afternoon, claiming he needed absolute quiet for critical merger work. Margaret was in town at a social function. Victor was at the office. Only Dr. Crane remained in the house, sequestered in his own quarters after their confrontation. Elliot and Naomi made their way to the old medical wing. The locked room waited at the end of a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Elliot used his master key, the one that opened every door in the mansion, and pushed inside. The room was exactly as Naomi had described. Child-sized furniture, vintage medical equipment, cabinets full of files and documentation. Start with the filing cabinets, Elliot signed. Look for anything from when I was between 4 and 6 years old. They worked in tense silence, pulling out drawer after drawer. Most of the early files were routine, standard pediatric checkups, developmental assessments, nothing unusual. But then Naomi found a drawer marked with dates from Elliot's 5th year. Inside were documents that changed everything. Patient intake forms for something called Project Hush. Consent forms signed by Margaret Graves as legal guardian. Detailed neurological assessments describing a child with abnormal auditory processing and extreme sensory hyperacuity. Treatment plans outlining an experimental neural suppression procedure. And photographs. Medical photographs of a young Elliot, electrodes attached to his skull, his small face twisted in distress. Elliot stared at the images, his hands trembling. That was him. 5 years old. Scared. In pain. Being experimented on. There's more. Naomi signed clumsily, pointing to another file. This one contained the actual procedure notes. Elliot forced himself to read them, his medical training helping him parse the technical language. What he found was horrifying in its precision. The procedure hadn't been designed to help him. It had been designed to control him. The neurosuppression system didn't just block his hearing. It dampened his entire auditory processing center, preventing his brain from interpreting sound at all. The doctors hadn't been treating a disability. They'd been creating one. Why? Elliot signed, his movements weak. Why would they do this? Naomi pulled out one more document. This one was a research proposal, stamped with approval signatures from multiple medical boards and funding organizations. The project's stated goal was to develop methods for managing children with extreme cognitive abilities. Children whose minds processed information too quickly, too intensely. Children who were, in the cold language of the proposal, cognitively unmanageable. Elliot had been the primary test subject. His hearing hadn't been the problem. It had been his brain's ability to process auditory information at levels far beyond normal human capacity. He could hear everything, everywhere, all at once. Every conversation in the house. Every footstep. Every whisper. So they'd shut it down. They'd taken a child who could hear too much and made him deaf. Not to help him. To make him controllable. Manageable. Safe for the people around him. My entire life, Elliot signed, his vision blurring. My entire identity, built on something they did to me. Naomi placed a gentle hand on his arm. When he looked at her, her eyes were full of an understanding that came from shared trauma. She wrote on her notepad, "There's something else you need to know." She pulled out her phone and showed him photographs she'd taken of other files. Patient records for other children. Dozens of them. All part of Project Hush. All subjected to various forms of neural suppression and sensory manipulation. "It wasn't just you," she wrote. "This was a program. A systematic effort to control gifted children." Elliot sank into one of the old examination chairs, his legs unable to support him anymore. The scope of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just about him. It was about an entire generation of children who'd been experimented on, altered, controlled. "We need to expose this," he signed. "All of it. Everyone needs to know." But even as he signed the words, the door opened. Margaret stood in the doorway, flanked by Dr. Crane and two security personnel Elliot didn't recognize. His aunt's face was a mask of cold fury. "Step away from those files," she said, signing as she spoke. "Both of you." Elliot stood, placing himself between Naomi and the security team. "These are my medical records. My history. You have no right to keep them from me. We have every right. We're protecting you from information that could psychologically destroy you." Margaret moved into the room, her heels clicking on the tile floor. "Dr. Crane warned me you were becoming unstable. I should have listened. Unstable." Elliot's signs were sharp. "You experimented on a child. On me. You stole my hearing. You built my entire life on a lie. And you're calling me unstable." Margaret's expression didn't change. "We saved your life, Elliot. You were suffering from sensory overload so severe that you couldn't function. You couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. You were in constant agony. The procedure gave you peace. It gave you a life. You gave me a prison." Elliot shouted the signs, his control shattering. "You took my choice, my body, my identity. Everything I am is something you created. Everything you are," Margaret said coldly, "is alive. Without our intervention, you would have destroyed yourself before you turned 10. The procedure was the only option." Dr. Crane stepped forward, his voice pleading. "Elliot, please. The neural pathways that were suppressed, they're still there. If you try to reactivate them now, after decades of dormancy, the sensory input could overwhelm you. It could cause permanent damage. Brain death. We're not trying to hide the truth from you. We're trying to keep you alive. Then why hide the records? Why dismiss Mrs. Patterson? Why threaten Naomi?" Elliot gestured to the files scattered around the room. "If this was all medically necessary, why the secrecy?" Margaret and Crane exchanged a look. Then Margaret spoke, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Because the procedure wasn't approved. The techniques we used, they were experimental, borderline illegal. If this becomes public, everyone involved faces criminal charges. Medical boards, universities, research facilities, all of it comes down, including your company. The Neurobridge merger would collapse. Your empire would be destroyed. So this is about protecting yourselves. It's about protecting everyone, including you. Margaret moved closer, her eyes intense. Think about what you're threatening to expose. Your entire public identity is built on being deaf. If the world learns the truth, that you were surgically altered as a child, how do you think they'll react? The media will tear you apart. Activists will make you a symbol. Lawyers will circle like sharks. Your life will never be private again. Elliot looked at the files, at the photographs of himself as a terrified child, at Naomi standing quietly behind him with her own history of loss and manipulation. Maybe that's a price worth paying, he signed. For the truth. The truth will destroy you, Margaret said flatly. I won't let that happen. Not after everything we've invested in keeping you safe. She nodded to the security team. Escort Miss Carter from the property. Immediately. Her employment is terminated. The guards moved toward Naomi. Elliot stepped in their path, his body language making his intent clear. She's not going anywhere, he signed. And if you try to force her, I'll call the police. The real police, not your private security. Let's see how you explain all of this to them. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You're making a terrible mistake. No, the mistake was made 33 years ago. I'm just finally seeing it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Margaret made a small gesture, and the security team stepped back. But her expression promised this wasn't over. You want the truth, Elliot? Fine, but understand what you're choosing. Once you open this door, you can't close it again. Your life, as you know it, ends. Maybe it's time for it to end, Elliot signed. Maybe I never really lived at all. Margaret left without another word, Dr. Crane following reluctantly behind her. The security team remained in the hallway, watching but not interfering. Elliot turned to Naomi. We need to move quickly. They'll try to destroy this evidence. We need copies of everything. Tonight. Naomi nodded and began photographing documents with her phone. But her hands were shaking, and when Elliot touched her shoulder questioningly, she wrote, Once we do this, they'll come after both of us. Are you ready for that? Elliot looked at the scattered files, the evidence of his stolen childhood, the truth he'd spent his entire life not knowing. No, he signed honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. They worked for hours documenting everything. Patient files, treatment protocols, consent forms, financial records. Naomi uploaded the photos to encrypted cloud storage as they went, creating multiple backups. As they worked, Elliot found more disturbing details. Project Hush hadn't ended with him. The program had continued for years afterward, expanding into other forms of neural manipulation. The Graves Family Foundation had funded it all, using Elliot's success as proof of concept. He also found records of other children. Names, ages, procedures. Some had been treated for hearing, others for vision, touch, taste. One file described a child whose sense of smell had been so acute it caused psychological trauma. They'd eliminated her olfactory processing entirely. These children, Elliot signed to Naomi. Where are they now? Naomi wrote, Some are dead. Suicide mostly. Others are institutionalized. A few, like you, are functional but believe their conditions are natural. My mother tried to track them all down before she died. She couldn't save most of them, but she tried to save me. She tried to save all of you. You're just the only one powerful enough to fight back. Elliot stared at the files, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over him. This wasn't just about his own truth anymore. It was about justice for all the children who'd been experimented on, manipulated, controlled. Children who'd never had the chance to fight back. Around midnight, Naomi showed Elliot something she'd been carrying in her bag since the day she arrived. A small device, carefully wrapped in protective foam. It looked like a modified hearing aid, but more complex, with connections and components that suggested serious engineering. What is this? Elliot signed. Naomi wrote carefully, her handwriting betraying her nervousness. It's a prototype my mother designed before she died. She called it Neural Key. It's supposed to bypass the suppression system and reactivate your original auditory pathways. Elliot took the device, turning it over in his hands. It was remarkably small, considering what Naomi claimed it could do. Does it work? I don't know. She never got it tested. But theoretically, If worn correctly and activated gradually, it should remove the block without causing the sensory overload Dr. Crane warned about. Theoretically, yes. Elliot set the device down on the table between them. What are the risks? Naomi wrote for a long time, choosing her words carefully. It could work perfectly and restore your hearing. It could partially work and give you fragments. Or it could flood your brain with sensory input you're not prepared to process. Dr. Crane isn't wrong about the danger. Your brain has adapted to silence for 33 years. Reintroducing sound could be traumatic, psychologically devastating. It might even cause physical damage. So I could end up with hearing, no hearing, or brain damage. Yes. Elliot picked up the device again, feeling its weight. It was such a small thing to hold his entire future in its circuits and wiring. Why did you bring this? He signed. Why not just show me the evidence and let me decide what to do with it? Naomi's answer was simple. Because you deserve the choice. The choice they never gave you. That word hit Elliot hard. Choice. His entire life had been built on decisions other people made for him. What he could hear, how he could communicate, who he could become. Even his empire, his success, his identity, all of it shaped by a procedure he'd never consented to. This device offered something he'd never had before. The chance to choose for himself what kind of person he wanted to be. Even if that choice came with terrible risks. I need time to think, he signed. Of course. But even as he said it, Elliot knew what his decision would be. He'd known from the moment he saw those childhood photographs, saw the fear in his own young eyes. If his life had been built on a lie, he wanted to face the truth, no matter what it cost. The next morning, Victor arrived at the mansion, summoned by Margaret. Elliot met him in the main study, Naomi standing quietly beside him despite Victor's obvious displeasure at her presence. "We need to talk about your recent behavior," Victor said, signing as he spoke. His hands moved with irritated precision. "Margaret tells me you've been accessing sealed medical files, making accusations, threatening to expose confidential information." Confidential. Elliot's signs were cold. Is that what we're calling it? Whatever happened in your childhood, it was done with the best medical advice available at the time. Dragging it into public view now will accomplish nothing except destroying everything you've built. Everything you've built, Elliot corrected. My money, my name, my silence. You've all profited from it. Victor's expression hardened. I'm here as your COO and as someone who's worked with you for 15 years. If you expose Project Hush, the Neura Bridge merger collapses. The company's value drops by billions. Partners withdraw. You'll lose everything. Maybe everything needs to be lost. Don't be naive. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping. You're not just a person, Elliot. You're a brand, an empire. Thousands of people depend on your company for their livelihoods. You want to destroy all of that for what? Revenge against people who thought they were helping you. They weren't helping me. They were controlling me. They gave you a life that most people can only dream of. Wealth, power, influence. You've achieved things that would have been impossible if you'd remained the way you were, a child in constant agony, unable to function. Elliot stood, his whole body radiating fury. Get out, Elliot. Get out of my house. You're fired. Security will escort you from the property. Victor's face went white. You can't fire me. The board. I am the majority shareholder. I control the board. You're fired. And if you try to interfere with what I do next, I'll make sure every business connection you have knows exactly what you enabled. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. When he was gone, Elliot sank back into his chair, exhausted. Naomi touched his arm gently, a question in her eyes. I'm sure Elliot signed. About everything, including the device. Naomi pulled out the neural key, setting it on the desk between them. It looked innocuous in the morning light, just a piece of technology. But they both knew it represented something far more profound. A choice, a risk, a chance. When Naomi signed, tonight, here, where it all started. Naomi nodded, but her expression was troubled. She wrote, they won't let this happen quietly. Margaret will try to stop us, maybe forcibly. Then we make sure she can't. Elliot pulled out his phone and began making calls. to lawyers, to journalists he trusted, to the few people in his life who'd always treated him as a person rather than an asset. He set things in motion: insurance policies, dead man switches. If anything happened to him or Naomi, the evidence would be released automatically. By late afternoon, the mansion had become a war zone of tense silence. Margaret returned and locked herself in her private wing. Dr. Crane tried once more to talk Elliot out of using the device, his pleading turning desperate. Security personnel moved through the halls, their presence ominous but not yet aggressive. Everyone was waiting to see what Elliot would do. As evening fell, Elliot and Naomi returned to the old medical wing. The room where it had all begun seemed fitting for what came next. Elliot sat in one of the examination chairs while Naomi prepared the neural key. Her hands shook as she calibrated the device. "I need you to understand something," she wrote. "Once we start this, we can't stop it. The device works on a timer, gradually increasing stimulation over several hours. If we abort midway, it could cause permanent damage." "I understand. And you still want to do this?" Elliot looked at her. This woman who'd walked into his life carrying the truth he'd been denied. This woman who understood what it meant to be someone else's experiment. "If my life was built on a lie," he signed, "I'd rather face the truth and lose everything." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, then carefully positioned the device behind Elliot's right ear, securing it with medical adhesive. "Are you ready?" she signed. Elliot closed his eyes. 33 years of silence pressed down on him, heavy and familiar. In moments, that silence would be challenged, maybe broken, maybe destroyed. He was terrified. He was ready. He nodded. Naomi activated the device. For several seconds, nothing happened. Elliot sat perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. Then something changed. It wasn't sound. Not yet. It was pressure, a sensation like something pushing against the inside of his skull. Not painful exactly, but deeply uncomfortable. Foreign. Wrong. Elliot's breathing quickened. His eyes opened, finding Naomi's face. "I feel it," he signed, his movements jerky. "Something's happening." Naomi watched him carefully, her phone ready to call for medical help if needed. But she didn't stop the device. Elliot had made his choice. The pressure grew. Elliot felt something inside his head shifting, pathways that had been dormant for decades suddenly flooding with signals. His brain didn't know how to interpret them yet. They were just data, raw and unprocessed. Then the pressure became something else. A sensation, a vibration, not in his body, but in his mind. The electrical hum of the device itself, processed not through his ears, but through neural pathways that were just beginning to remember their original purpose. Elliot gasped, his whole body going rigid. It wasn't sound, not the way people described sound. It was alive, pressing against him from inside his own head. Tears spilled down his face without permission. His hands clutched at the chair as if he might fly apart. And then, very faintly, beneath the chaos of sensation and neural fire, he heard something. A voice. Naomi, speaking his name. The world Elliot Graves had known for 33 years shattered like glass. And through the cracks, sound rushed in like a flood. His eyes widened in shock and terror, and something that might have been joy. He gasped, and for the first time in his remembered life, he heard himself breathe. The device had activated, and now there was no turning back. Elliot sat frozen in the examination chair, his entire body locked in place as his brain struggled to process signals it hadn't interpreted in over 3 decades. The sensation was unlike anything he could have imagined. Not peaceful, not gentle, but violent and overwhelming. At first, there was only chaos. Neural pathways firing wildly, his mind trying desperately to make sense of input it didn't recognize. Pain shot through his temples, sharp and insistent. His breathing became erratic, shallow gasps that didn't seem to bring enough oxygen. He clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles went white, his whole body trembling with the effort of staying conscious. Then something broke through the chaos. A low, distant vibration, not felt through his body the way vibrations usually were, but perceived through some other sense entirely. The electrical whir of the device itself transmitted directly into his awakening auditory cortex. Elliot's eyes flew open wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream. Or perhaps not silent at all, he couldn't tell. Tears spilled down his face, hot and uncontrolled. This wasn't sound as he'd imagined it from books and descriptions. This was assault. This was his brain being torn apart and rebuilt in real time. Naomi moved closer, her expression tight with concern. She signed, "Can you hear me?" but also spoke the word aloud. And Elliot felt something strike him from inside his own head. Not words yet. His brain didn't know how to separate sounds in a language, but a living presence. A force that came from outside him, but landed inside his consciousness with shocking intimacy. He collapsed forward, sobbing. Not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming reality of it. Sound existed. It was real, and it was destroying him. Naomi's hands moved to adjust the device, her fingers quick and practiced. She prepared for this possibility, the sensory overload that Dr. Crane had warned about. She pulled out a small tablet connected to the neural key and began making rapid adjustments, dampening the input, narrowing the frequency range. But she didn't turn it off. Elliot had made her promise not to, no matter how bad it got. As she worked, footsteps thundered in the hallway outside. The door burst open, and Dr. Crane rushed in, flanked by 2 medical assistants carrying emergency equipment. "What have you done?" Crane shouted, his face pale with terror. He moved toward Elliot, reaching for the device. Naomi stepped between them, her body language fierce despite her slight frame. She signed sharply. "He chose this. Don't touch him. He's going into neural shock. His brain can't process this kind of input." Crane tried to push past her, but Elliot's hand shot out, gripping the doctor's wrist with surprising strength. Elliot's eyes met Crane's. Even through his tears and obvious distress, his gaze was clear, determined. He signed weakly with his free hand, "No." "Elliot, please." "No." He signed again, more forcefully. "This is mine. My choice." Crane stared at him for a long moment, watching as Elliot shook with the effort of staying conscious, of not giving in to the overwhelming assault on his senses. Then something in the doctor's face crumbled. "I'm sorry," Crane whispered, though Elliot couldn't hear the words. "I'm so sorry for what we did to you." Naomi continued adjusting the device's output. Gradually, the chaos in Elliot's head began to narrow. The cacophony of sensation compressed into something more manageable. Not silence, but a controlled stream of input. The pain receded slightly, from unbearable to merely excruciating. Elliot's breathing slowed. His grip on the chair relaxed fractionally. The flood became a river, became a stream. And in that stream, something extraordinary happened. His brain, starved for auditory input for 33 years, began doing what it was designed to do. It started organizing the chaos, finding patterns, creating meaning. The electrical whir of the device became distinct from the ambient hum of the room's ventilation. The rustle of fabric as Naomi moved became separate from the creak of the old examination chair. His own ragged breathing emerged as its own discrete presence. They weren't words yet. They weren't music or voice or anything beautiful. But they were distinct, individual, real. Elliot looked at Naomi through his tears. She was watching him with an expression of hope and fear mixed together. She spoke his name, slowly, carefully. "Elliot." This time, instead of just feeling the assault of presence, he felt something more. A shape to it, a beginning, middle, and end. His brain recognized it as directed, as intentional, as meant for him. Not the word yet, but close. So close. He reached out and gripped her hand, squeezing hard. She squeezed back, understanding without words what this moment meant. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury mixed with something that might have been fear. She took in the scene, Elliot in tears, the device active, Dr. Crane standing helplessly nearby. "Shut it down," she ordered. "Now." "No," Naomi said, her voice steady despite her fear. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I'm calling security. You'll be removed from this property and charged with assault. "Try it," Naomi replied. "The moment your security touches me, encrypted files go to every major news outlet in the country, with timestamped video of everything that's happened tonight, including your orders to stop a man from accessing his own medical records." Margaret went very still. "You're bluffing." "Test me." For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. Then Margaret's gaze shifted to Elliot. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Elliot lifted his head, meeting his aunt's eyes. His hands moved slowly, shakily, but clearly no. "You made that mistake 33 years ago. I'm just finally correcting it." Margaret turned and left without another word, but everyone in the room knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a war. Over the next several hours, Elliot remained in the medical wing as the device continued its work. Naomi stayed beside him, monitoring the output levels, making micro-adjustments as his brain adapted. Dr. Crane, after his initial attempt to intervene, had withdrawn to a corner of the room, watching with the expression of a man witnessing something he'd always feared. The sensory input came in waves, sometimes manageable, sometimes overwhelming. Elliot learned to breathe through the worst moments, to focus on individual sounds rather than trying to process everything at once. His brain was building new pathways, reconnecting circuits that had been dormant since childhood. Around midnight, something shifted. Elliot had been dozing, exhausted from hours of neural stress, when a sound pulled him back to consciousness. Not the constant hum of machinery or ventilation, but something new. A voice. Distant, muffled, but distinctly human. Someone speaking in another part of the house. Elliot's eyes snapped open. He touched Naomi's arm urgently, pointing toward the hallway. She listened, then wrote quickly on her notepad. "Security. They're discussing whether to intervene forcibly." Elliot stood on shaky legs, his balance still affected by the neural changes happening in his brain. He moved to the doorway, straining to process what his newly awakening hearing was detecting. The voices grew clearer as his brain learned to focus on them. Not words yet. He still couldn't separate sounds in a language with meaning. But tones, urgency, the rhythm of argument. They were planning something. And whatever it wasn't going to wait for morning. Naomi joined him at the doorway, her phone in hand. "We need to leave. Now, before they decide the risk of exposure is worth stopping us." Elliot nodded. They moved quickly, gathering the files and documentation they'd collected, securing the physical evidence. Naomi uploaded final backups to her encrypted cloud storage, while Elliot sent messages to the journalists and lawyers he'd contacted earlier, activating the first level of his contingency plans. As they prepared to leave the medical wing, Dr. Crane stood. "Wait." They turned. The doctor looked older than Elliot had ever seen him, decades of guilt finally showing on his face. "I need you to understand something," Crane said, signing as he spoke. "What we did, it wasn't malicious. Your mind was extraordinary, Elliot, but it was also destroying you. At 5 years old, you couldn't sleep because you could hear conversations happening 3 floors away. You couldn't eat because the sound of your own chewing was overwhelming. You were in constant agony." Elliot's new hearing caught fragments of the words, though he still couldn't fully process their meaning. But he could read lips, and he could see the genuine anguish in Crane's expression. "The procedure was meant to give you peace," Crane continued, "to let you be a child instead of a prisoner to your own senses. We believed we were saving your life." Elliot signed back, his movements slow and deliberate. "Maybe you believed that. Maybe it was even true. But you never gave me the choice. You never let me decide if the cure was worse than the condition. You were 5 years old. You couldn't make that choice. Then you should have found another way. One that didn't steal who I was meant to be." Crane's face crumbled. "I know. God help me, I know." Elliot stood there for a moment, looking at this man who'd been part of his life for so long, who'd monitored every aspect of his health, who'd helped build the cage that had held him for decades. "When this all comes out," Elliot signed, "I won't protect you, but I won't destroy you either. What happens to you will depend on what you do next. Help us expose the truth, or help them bury it. Choose carefully." Crane nodded slowly, tears sliding down his face. Elliot and Naomi left the medical wing and made their way through the mansion's back corridors. The house that had been Elliot's prison for so long felt different now. Every sound was a revelation and a challenge. The whisper of air conditioning, the distant murmur of voices, the creak of old wood settling. His brain was still learning to organize it all, but with each passing hour, the chaos resolved a little more into meaning. They reached Elliot's private office. He sat at his computer and began the work he'd been preparing for. Emails to board members, messages to key shareholders, statements prepared for the media. Everything carefully crafted to control the narrative before Margaret and her allies could spin their own version. Naomi worked beside him, cross-referencing files, organizing evidence, building the case that would dismantle Project Hush and expose everyone involved. Around 3 in the morning, Elliot heard something that made him freeze. Not through the device, not through his gradually awakening hearing, but through the vibrations he'd always been able to feel. Footsteps, multiple people, moving with purpose toward his office. He touched Naomi's arm in warning. She looked up, listening with her full hearing, and her expression confirmed his fear. "They're coming," she mouthed. Elliot quickly encrypted the files they'd been working on and set up the final deadman switch. If he didn't enter a specific code, every 6 hours, everything would automatically release to the journalists waiting for it. The door opened. Margaret entered, flanked by Victor, who apparently hadn't accepted his firing, and 4 private security personnel that Elliot didn't recognize. Not the mansion's regular staff. These are professionals brought in for a specific purpose. Margaret's expression was ice. "I gave you a chance to stop this quietly. You refused. Now we do this the hard way." "The hard way?" Elliot signed. "What does that mean? Are you going to imprison me in my own house? Forcibly sedate me? Destroy the evidence? If necessary, yes. All of it." Margaret moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which made it more terrifying. "I didn't want to come to this, Elliot. But you're threatening to destroy not just yourself, but hundreds of people whose careers depend on Project Hush remaining buried. Medical professionals, researchers, administrators, they all have families, lives, futures. Your crusade for truth will ruin them. They ruined children," Elliot signed. "Systematically. For years. They deserve to be ruined. They saved those children from lives of agony. Just as we saved you. You didn't save me. You control me. There's a difference." Margaret sighed, a sound of deep weariness. "Remove the device, by force if necessary, and confiscate all computers, phones, and storage devices from both of them." The security team moved forward. Naomi stepped in front of Elliot, her small frame no match for the trained professionals, but her intent clear. Then Elliot did something that surprised everyone. He spoke, or tried to. His voice, and used for 33 years, except in therapy that had been discontinued in childhood, came out rough and unpracticed, but audible. "Stop." The single word was barely recognizable, more croak than speech. But it was sound, produced intentionally, heard by everyone in the room. Even Margaret froze, shock registering on her face. Elliot stood, his new hearing catching the sharp intake of breath from multiple people, the rustle of fabric, the electric tension in the room. He pulled out his phone and activated a video call. On the screen appeared a woman Elliot had contacted hours earlier, Rachel Morrison, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corporate and medical corruption. She'd been standing by, waiting. "Ms. Morrison," Elliot spoke slowly, each word an effort. "Please record this." He turned the camera toward Margaret and the security team. Then, using both sign language and his broken voice, he made a statement for the camera. "My name is Elliot Graves. I was not born deaf. At age 5, I was subjected to an experimental neural suppression procedure without my consent. The procedure was part of a larger program called Project Hush, funded by my family and conducted on multiple children. Tonight, my family and their associates are attempting to forcibly remove a medical device that is reversing that procedure and to destroy evidence of their crimes." Margaret lunged for the phone, but Naomi intercepted her, and in the scuffle that followed, the phone transmitted everything. The shouting. Margaret's orders to shut this down now. The security team's advance. But before they could reach Elliot, his office door burst open again. This time, it was actual police, local officers responding to a 911 call that Naomi had made from a burner phone 30 minutes earlier. Time to arrive at exactly this moment. Someone called about a medical emergency and possible unlawful imprisonment, the lead officer said, his eyes taking in the scene with immediate suspicion. Everything stopped. Margaret's face went pale. Victor took a step back. The security team lowered their hands slowly, recognizing the shift in power. Elliot kept the video call running, kept Rachel Morrison witnessing everything. "Officers," he said in his rough, unpracticed voice, "I'd like to report multiple crimes, and I have extensive documentation to support my claims." The next 72 hours became a blur of activity. Police interviews, lawyer consultations, medical examinations by independent doctors who documented both Elliot's awakening hearing and the evidence of the childhood procedure. Rachel Morrison's first article went live within 12 hours, titled "The Silent Billionaire Who Was Never Deaf." The response was explosive. Other journalists picked up the story. Social media erupted with outrage and debate. Medical ethics boards launched emergency investigations. Law enforcement at state and federal levels began asking questions. And other victims started coming forward. Adults who'd been children in Project Hush, who'd been told their conditions were natural, who'd lived their entire lives not knowing they'd been experimented on. Naomi's mother's research helped identify dozens of them. Some were functional, like Elliot, living with the modifications. Others had been destroyed by the procedures, institutionalized, dead by suicide, or simply broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. Elliot funded a legal team to represent all of them. He established a foundation to provide therapy, medical care, and support. He opened his own medical records and those he'd recovered from the mansion to independent review. The evidence was overwhelming. Consent forms that had been forged or coerced. Procedures performed on children too young to understand. Complications covered up. Deaths attributed to other causes. An entire systematic program of experimentation justified by the belief that some children's minds were too dangerous to be left unaltered. Margaret was arrested. So was Dr. Crane, though his cooperation with investigators earned him a plea deal. Victor disappeared, fleeing to a country without extradition treaties. Others involved in Project Hush scrambled to lawyer up, to distance themselves, to claim they'd only been following orders or hadn't known the full scope of what was happening. But the truth was out, and it couldn't be buried again. Through all of this, Elliot's hearing continued to develop. The neural key device remained active, gradually expanding the range of frequencies his brain could process. Each day brought new sounds into focus. The chirp of birds outside his window, the rustle of wind through trees, the distinct tones of different voices. Naomi became his guide through this new sensory world. She taught him to identify sounds, to separate important audio from background noise, to understand the social cues embedded in tone and volume that he'd never experienced before. One afternoon, about a month after the device's activation, Naomi played him a recording. Simple piano music, a basic melody repeated slowly. Elliot listened, and for the first time, he understood what people meant when they talked about music as beautiful. It wasn't just organized sound. It was emotion made audible, pattern and variation creating something that reached past logic into feeling. Tears streamed down his face as the melody continued. Naomi sat beside him, her own eyes wet, understanding without words what this moment represented. When the recording ended, Elliot turned to her and spoke, his voice still rough but growing stronger each day. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me back myself. The self I never got to know." Naomi shook her head. "I didn't give you anything. You chose this. You fought for it." "We fought for it," Elliot corrected. "Together." She smiled, and in that smile, Elliot saw the reflection of his own journey. Two people shaped by the same machine, damaged in different ways, finding healing in shared truth. But the fight wasn't over. Even with arrests made and investigations launched, powerful people were working to minimize the damage, to spin the narrative, to claim that Project Hush had been a well-intentioned program that had merely made mistakes rather than a systematic violation of human rights. Corporate lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence. Medical boards filled with allies of the original researchers issued statements defending the procedures as experimental but not unethical. Politicians who'd received funding from the institutions involved suddenly developed concerns about trial by media and the need for measured responses. Elliot watched it all unfold with growing fury. The same systems that had protected Project Hush for decades were trying to protect it still. So he made a decision. He wouldn't just expose what had been done. He would burn down the entire corrupt infrastructure that had enabled it. He liquidated assets, dissolved partnerships with institutions involved in the cover-up, used his wealth and influence to pressure medical boards, universities, and regulatory agencies. Every door that tried to close, he forced back open with money, lawyers, and the relentless pressure of public attention. Naomi worked beside him, managing the victim support network, organizing testimonies, ensuring that the voices of those harmed weren't drowned out by bureaucratic procedure and legal maneuvering. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of depositions and media interviews, Naomi found Elliot sitting alone in his study. He'd removed the neural key device temporarily. He could do that now, had enough voluntary control over his hearing that the device wasn't needed constantly. In the silence that returned when the device was off, Elliot looked more at peace than she'd ever seen him. "You know what I realized?" he said, signed, actually, since she couldn't hear him without the device active. "What?" "I don't hate the silence anymore. Now that I can choose it, it's not a prison. It's just a state. Like hearing is a state. Neither one defines me." Naomi smiled. "That's good. That's really good. But I'm glad I have both now. The choice changes everything." "Yes," she agreed. "Choice changes everything." A comfortable quiet settled between them. Then Elliot activated the device again, and the world of sound rushed back. But this time, instead of chaos, it felt like coming home. His brain had adapted enough that sound was no longer an assault. It was information, communication, life. He heard Naomi's breathing, steady and calm, the rustle of papers on his desk, the distant murmur of activity from other parts of the house, a house that no longer felt like a prison, but simply like a building he happened to live in. "There's something I haven't told you," Naomi said softly. Elliot looked at her, waiting. "My mother's files. There's one more thing in them. A list of names. Not victims. Perpetrators. People who knew exactly what Project Hush was doing and actively covered it up. Some of them are still in positions of power, running medical boards, teaching at universities, approving research grants. You think we should go after them? I think we need to, because if we don't, this happens again. Maybe not exactly the same way, but the same mindset, that some children are too different, too difficult, too extraordinary to be allowed to exist as they are. That controlling them is kindness. That engineering them into something manageable is mercy." Elliot nodded slowly. She was right. This wasn't just about justice for what had been done. It was about preventing it from happening again. "Then let's do it," he said. "All of it, no matter how long it takes." Naomi's expression was fierce and grateful. "We're going to make a lot of enemies. We already have. Might as well make them count." That night, Elliot heard something that changed everything. He was alone in his bedroom, the neural key device still active, when a sound reached him from outside. Faint at first, then growing clearer as his brain focused on it. A whisper, not from the hallway or nearby rooms, from much farther away, perhaps the grounds outside, perhaps even beyond the property. And he understood it. Not every word, but enough. Someone talking about him, about the mansion, about plans being made. His hearing wasn't just returning. It was becoming what it had been before the procedure. Extraordinary, sensitive beyond normal human range. The very thing Project Hush had been designed to suppress. Dr. Crane's warnings echoed in his mind. Your mind was extraordinary, but it was also destroying you. Elliot sat very still, listening to the whispered conversation he shouldn't be able to hear, processing sounds from distances that should be impossible. For the first time since activating the device, he wondered if maybe Just maybe the people who'd altered him had been right about one thing. Not about their methods, not about taking his choice, but about the fundamental challenge of living with a mind that perceived too much. Because now he could hear everything, and he didn't know if that was a gift or a curse. Or perhaps, he thought, listening to the whispers fade into the night, it was simply the truth of who he'd always been meant to be. And learning to live with that truth, to manage it, to use it, to make it serve him rather than destroy him, that would be his real challenge. Not the fight against those who'd harmed him, but the fight to become himself fully, completely, without fear of his own extraordinary nature. The question wasn't whether he could handle it. The question was what kind of person he would become once he did. 3 months after the device's activation, Naomi made a discovery that changed everything. She was reviewing her mother's encrypted files, documents she'd been working through systematically, cataloging names and crimes, when she found something that made her blood run cold. A patient intake form. The handwriting was her mother's. The date was 26 years ago, and the name on the form was her own. Naomi Carter. Age 2. Diagnosis: extreme auditory hypersensitivity with associated behavioral dysregulation. She sat frozen, staring at the screen. This couldn't be right. She'd always known her mother had worked on Project Hush. That was why she'd spent years preparing to expose it. But she'd never considered that she herself might have been part of it. Her hand shook as she opened the attached files. Medical records documenting procedures performed on a toddler. Neural assessments. Treatment protocols. Her mother's notes describing a child who couldn't sleep because she heard everything, who screamed constantly from sensory overload, who was slowly being destroyed by her own extraordinary hearing. Just like Elliot had been. The difference was that her mother had pulled her from the program. At age 3, Sarah Carter had falsified records, destroyed data, and disappeared with her daughter. She'd spent the rest of her life hiding what had been done, giving Naomi a normal childhood by erasing all evidence of the procedures. But the procedures had still happened. Naomi's calm demeanor, her unusual sensitivity to sound, the gaps in her early memories, they all suddenly made horrible sense. She'd been a victim too. She just hadn't known it. Naomi found Elliot in the converted office space they'd been using to coordinate the legal cases. He was reviewing testimony from another Project Hush survivor, his expression tight with controlled anger. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. He looked up, and whatever he saw on her face made him set aside his work immediately. "What's wrong?" She showed him the files, watched as he read through them, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked like grief. "You were in the program," he said softly when he finished. "I was. My mother got me out, but not before they'd already started the suppression procedures." Naomi's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "I've been helping other victims, advocating for them, organizing their testimonies. And the whole time, I was one of them. I just didn't remember." Elliot stood and pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened at first, then collapsed against him, the weight of the revelation finally breaking through her composure. "We're the same," she whispered. "Both of us shaped by the same machine. Both of us never knowing who we might have been." "No," Elliot said firmly. "We're not the same. Your mother saved you. She gave you a childhood, a life without the isolation I had. She died trying to protect you from ever knowing what had been done. But what if I needed to know? What if part of me has always been missing, and I never realized it?" Elliot pulled back to look at her. "Then we figure out. Together. The same way you helped me." That evening, they sat together in what had become their shared workspace. The neural key device that had restored Elliot's hearing sat on the table between them, a reminder of choice, of risk, of transformation. "I could use it," Naomi said, looking at the device. "Find out what my hearing could have been. What I was meant to be." "You could," Elliot agreed. "But you don't have to. Your mother made a choice to protect you from this. That choice was an act of love. You don't have to undo it just because you know about it now." "Don't you wonder what I might hear if the suppression was removed?" "Of course I do. But I also know that whatever you decide, it has to be your choice. Not mine. Not your mother's ghost. Yours alone." Naomi nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the device. "I don't know what I want yet. Is that okay?" It's more than okay. It's honest. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Naomi asked the question that had been bothering her since finding the files. Do you regret it? Using the device? Now that you know your extraordinary hearing is coming back. The same thing they tried to suppress in the first place. Elliot considered carefully. His hearing had indeed evolved beyond normal ranges over the past months. He could detect conversations from impossible distances, hear frequencies that most humans couldn't perceive. Some nights, the sensory input was overwhelming, forcing him to use meditation techniques and sometimes remove the device temporarily just to find peace. No, he said finally, I don't regret it, because even with the challenges, it's mine now. I control it. I understand it. That's completely different from having it controlled for me. But Dr. Crane was right, wasn't he? About you suffering as a child. About the sensory overload destroying you. Maybe. Probably. But we'll never know if there could have been another way. Therapy. Training. Gradual desensitization. They never tried anything else. They just cut away the part of me that was difficult to manage. Elliot's voice was calm but firm. I'm not saying what I'm dealing with now is easy, but it's honest, and I'd rather struggle with truth than live comfortably in a lie. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Margaret's trial became a media spectacle, with testimonies from Project Hush victims filling courtrooms and news cycles. The evidence was overwhelming: forged consent forms, hidden medical complications, payments to silence whistleblowers. But Margaret's defense team was skilled. They painted a picture of well-intentioned medical professionals trying to help children in genuine distress. They brought in experts who testified about the severity of sensory processing disorders, about children who truly suffered without intervention. They argued that the procedures, while ethically questionable by modern standards, had been performed with the genuine belief that they were necessary. The jury struggled. The verdict, when it came, was mixed. Margaret was found guilty of fraud and conspiracy, but acquitted of the more serious charges of assault and child endangerment. She received a 5-year sentence, likely to be reduced to 3 with good behavior. It wasn't enough. Not for what she'd done, but it was something. Dr. Crane's testimony had been crucial in securing even that partial conviction. In exchange for his cooperation, he received probation and the permanent revocation of his medical license. He'd never practiced medicine again, but he'd avoided prison. Elliot watched the verdict come down with mixed feelings. Justice, but incomplete. Accountability, but insufficient. The system that had enabled Project Hush remained largely intact, its most powerful members shielded by wealth, connections, and the passage of time. It's not enough, Naomi said, echoing his thoughts as they left the courthouse. No, Elliot agreed. But it's not nothing either. That night, Elliot made a decision about his company. He stepped down as CEO of Graves Industries and transferred majority control to a newly formed ethics board composed entirely of Project Hush survivors and their advocates. The company's focus shifted from profit-driven medical technology to survivor support and ethical research oversight. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Stock prices plummeted. Shareholders sued. Business partners withdrew. Within weeks, Elliot's net worth had dropped by billions. He didn't care. Naomi found him one afternoon in what used to be his private study, now converted into a resource center for survivors. He was helping a young woman, another Project Hush victim, navigate disability services and therapy options. You gave it all up, Naomi observed after the woman left. Not all of it. I kept enough to be comfortable, to fund the foundation, to keep fighting. Elliot smiled slightly. Everything else was just weight anyway. It feels good to put down. No regrets. About the money? None. About the years I lost? Yes. Always. But I can't get those back. I can only choose what happens next. Months turned into a year. The media frenzy eventually died down, replaced by new scandals and crises. But the work continued. The foundation Elliot established grew, supporting dozens of Project Hush survivors. Some are learning to live with their modifications. Others, like Elliot, were exploring reversal procedures under careful medical supervision. Naomi decided not to use the NeuroKey device. After weeks of consideration, she concluded that her mother's choice had given her something valuable, a normal life, free from the isolation Elliot had experienced. Undoing that felt like rejecting her mother's sacrifice. But she did undergo therapy to process the revelation of her past. And she continued working with survivors, her own experience making her an even more effective advocate. One spring afternoon, Elliot took Naomi to a city park. It was the first time he'd been in such a crowded public space since his hearing had fully returned. The sensory input was intense. Hundreds of conversations, footsteps, wind through trees, traffic sounds, birds, children playing. His extraordinary hearing detected all of it simultaneously. For a moment, the old panic rose. The feeling of being overwhelmed, of drowning in sound. But then he breathed, focused, used the techniques he developed over months of practice. His brain sorted the sounds, creating hierarchy and priority. The chaos resolved into manageable streams of information. "You okay?" Naomi asked, watching his face. "Yeah," Elliot said, surprised by how true it was. "I'm actually okay." They walked through the park, Naomi pointing out sights while Elliot listened to the symphony of urban life. Not just hearing it, but choosing what to focus on. Conversations that interested him. Music from a distant street performer. The laughter of children. And when it became too much, he adjusted the neural key device, reducing input to comfortable levels. The choice was his. Always his. "I've been thinking about something," Naomi said as they sat on a bench overlooking a pond. "What you said about silence not being a prison anymore, now that you can choose it. Yeah, I think that's true for both of us. I can choose not to know what my hearing could have been. You can choose when to hear and when to rest. That choice, that agency, it's what they took from us. And it's what we took back." Elliot nodded, watching sunlight dance on water. "We can't undo what was done, but we can decide what it means. What we do with it. And what are you going to do with it?" Elliot thought about the question. A year ago, he would have said he'd use it for revenge, for complete destruction of everyone involved. But that rage had burned itself out, leaving something else in its place. "I'm going to live," he said simply. "Really live. Not as the silent billionaire, or as a victim, or as anything someone else made me. Just as myself, whoever that is." "And who is that?" Elliot smiled. "I'm still figuring it out. But for the first time in my life, I get to discover it on my own terms." That evening, back at the mansion that he decided to convert into the Foundation's headquarters, Elliot did something he'd never done before. He recorded a message, not for journalists or lawyers or judges, but for other survivors. For anyone who'd had their body, their mind, their identity stolen by people who claimed to know better. His voice was stronger now, practiced enough to be clearly understood. He spoke slowly, carefully, but with conviction. "My name is Elliot Graves. I was silenced for 33 years by people who believed they were helping me. They were wrong. Not because their intentions were malicious, but because they never gave me the chance to be who I was meant to be. They chose comfort over truth, control over freedom. I'm not here to tell you what to do with your own story. I don't know if you should seek reversal procedures or therapy or legal action or nothing at all. That's your choice to make. The only choice that matters. What I can tell you is this. Silence didn't protect me. It hid what they were afraid of. And what they were afraid of was simply me, unfiltered, uncontrolled, fully myself. That fear was never about my well-being. It was about their comfort. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that's easier to manage. You deserve the chance to be exactly who you are in all your extraordinary, difficult, beautiful complexity. And if that's too much for the world to handle, then the world needs to change, not you." He finished recording and sent the video to Naomi for review. A few minutes later, his phone lit up with her response. "Perfect. Post it." Elliot did. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages from survivors, from families, from people who'd never known about Project Hush, but recognized themselves in his words. He read through them late into the night. Naomi beside him, both of them crying and laughing at the stories people shared. Finally, around midnight, Naomi stood and stretched. "I'm going to bed. You should too. In a minute." But after she left, Elliot stayed in the quiet office, the neural key device resting in his palm. He could remove it now, return to the silence he'd known for most of his life, or keep it active and continue hearing the world in all its chaotic beauty. He chose to keep it on, not because hearing was better than silence, but because the choice itself was what mattered. Outside, the world continued its endless conversation. Traffic hummed on distant roads. Wind whispered through trees. A cat prowled through the garden, its movements nearly silent, but just perceptible to Elliot's extraordinary senses. He listened to it all, not as an assault or an obligation, but as evidence of his own agency. He was hearing because he chose to hear. And if he chose differently tomorrow, that would be fine too. For the first time in his life, Elliot Graves was exactly who he wanted to be. Not silent, not speaking, just present, just real, just himself. And that, he realized, was enough. If someone stole your identity before you were old enough to choose, would you risk everything to reclaim it, even if the truth destroyed the life you'd built? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories that make you think.